A government report commissioned following the Grenfell fire laid out a number of specific changes that had to be made to how buildings were constructed, particularly with regard to cladding and what rules they had to follow. But since then, thousands of leaseholders have been landed with huge bills to make their own buildings safe. Now, Newsnight has been learning about a whole new problem for leaseholders that has nothing to do with cladding and won't be solved by any of the new changes to the construction laws. There are blocks like Transport House in Salford, where leaseholders believe at least some of their financial pain could have been avoided if developers there had simply followed guidance in place when the building was built. Tonight we ask why the huge financial burden once again is falling on leaseholders to solve a problem that might well have been avoided. Here's Lewis Goodall.
Transport House in Salford is just one development caught up in the building safety crisis, but it may be an instructive one. When we last spoke to its leaseholders, grappling with costs of over £3 million, £100,000 each that they'd been told is needed to make their homes safe from flame, we explored the ways in which the changes to the post-Grenfell buildings regime had affected the residents. But there's a more important part to this story.
Newsnight has been investigating what went wrong at Transport House, both for its own sake, but also because it might tell us something about what's happened in other parts of the country as well. And we can reveal that much of the cost, and therefore with it much of the heartache and the anguish that has been incurred by leaseholders, could have been avoided if developers had simply followed guidance that was already in place back in 2004 when the building was built. And experts tell us that that is a story which is repeated up and down the country.
Let's go back, not to the regulation now, but the regulation then. Central to this is one line of the 2000 building regulations. The external walls of the building shall adequately resist the spread of fire over the walls and from one building to another, having regard to the height, use and position of the building. But some leaseholders at Transport House don't believe that their building did meet that regulation, even when it was built.
We were told they put it in because they couldn't get a smooth finish on the render.
Around the facade of the building is a render. 2 layers below that is something called rock wool, a material designed to be a fire cavity barrier, to keep a fire contained to one bit of the building should one break out. The problem is what's in between, a thin layer of EPS polystyrene used to create a smooth finish on the external render. It is this, which is combustible, that we are told by experts effectively renders the fire cavity ineffective.
If you imagine that if we create a void into which all of that energy can pass, and then we have combustible materials and no restriction to it, the fire is going to find a way of travelling up through those voids. The physics of it also means that if you create a chimney effect, which is what we do by creating a restricted void, the fire will search for oxygen and extend its length by up to 20 times. So it's a major problem. So cavity barriers in the prescribed locations are the absolute minimum standard that you require in an external cavity construction.
More importantly, we've seen documents which suggest that the freeholder, Irwell Valley, has concerns about this as well. In a letter to leaseholders, they say, the investigations also identified that there are insufficient fire cavity barriers around windows and party wall junctions. In minutes of a meeting between leaseholders and Irwell on the 10th of June, again seen by Newsnight, a leaseholder questioned Irwell about this very issue and whether the lack of fire breaks meant that the building did not meet regulations. The Irwell representative replied that this question forms an integral part of our investigations. And Newsnight has also seen a presentation on Transport House based on work by the construction consultancy firm BWP. In it, they say that government guidance at the time, called Approved Document B, said that cavity barriers should be provided. And indeed, the 2000 version of the guidance contains detailed reference to the use of cavity barriers in flats. So too does other guidance.
That isn't the only way that the developers could have met the regulations. They could have installed something which did the same job as the cavity barriers, i.e., as the regulations put it, that adequately resist the spread of fire over the walls. But the very fact that this work is now looming could imply that they did not do so, or at the very least, that it wasn't very successful.
So the important thing to realise here is that the leaseholders aren't facing an enormous cost as a result of some great change that has taken place since these homes were built. The importance of cavity barriers or such like were known at the time that they were built. They were in the guidance issued by the government. And if the developers in question had simply followed that guidance, then much of the costs that the leaseholders are now facing simply would not be happening. For leaseholders, it is perhaps the biggest injustice yet.
When you followed every aspect of the law and you followed every aspect of planning and you've purchased your leasehold property through all the correct means, then to have something like a huge bill to fix mechanisms that should be in place in the first place, it's alarming. I feel like we're going to be the fall guys because we have no legal rights.
On several occasions, we asked the developer, Lovell, to explain how in their assessment they met their regulatory requirements in Transport House, especially with regards to fire cavity breaks or an equivalent measure. They didn't answer any of the specific questions we put to them, but they did say, the design and construction of Transport House met the relevant building regulations in force at the time, more than 16 years ago, and the relevant building control completion certificate was issued, which provides evidence that the local authority building control was satisfied that compliance had been achieved. But that doesn't necessarily mean as much as you might think.
The sign-off by building control of a building is just a random inspection of on a number of visits of certain aspects of the building. And every single building that has now had external cladding condemned and is being remediated, and everybody is aware of the costs of that going forward, has at some stage been signed off by building control. So saying that the building control has signed it and therefore it's acceptable is not adequate.
This speaks to a much wider story which goes far beyond Transport House. For a start, experts we've spoken to tell us that the EPS and fire cavity barrier problem is a common one, and secondly, it adverts to the fact that for decades now, the regulatory, scrutiny and enforcement systems which exist for buildings in this country have been marked by failure. The Hackett report of 2018 laid bare the extent of the failure of our buildings regime. In her report, Dame Judith Hackett said that there was 1. Ignorance about the rules, which were too complex. 2. Indifference, with developers motivated too often by cost alone. 3. A lack of clarity on roles and responsibilities within the regulatory framework. And 4. Inadequate regulatory oversight and enforcement tools. All of which, Dame Judith said, had created a race to the bottom in development of Britain's buildings. Historically, it was the responsibility of local authorities to ensure buildings were compliant with building regulations, but for a long time, that hasn't been the whole picture. Why didn't the council at the time pick up on that and say, well, hang on a minute, this isn't right?
So local authorities receive the information from the developer and obviously look over that information and see whether it conforms with what was passed at the planning committee. And that's the level of engagement and involvement from local authorities. They're not on site when a building is being built, looking at every single thing that is being done. There's no requirements for that in the building legislation. And obviously, over time, what we've seen is a watering down of that regulatory environment and, in a sense, a disempowering of local authorities.
There are a lot of questions for a lot of people in the national part of this story. Regulators, national government, local government, freeholders, developers, 3 decades of an unsatisfactory building regime. Only the leaseholders have had no part to play, who are definitely blameless, and yet it is they who are being asked to pay the price.
That was Lewis Goodall, and Dame Judith Hackett conducted an independent review into building standards following the tragedy of Grenfell Fire, and she joins us now. Dame Judith, what we learn, and of course it's not specific to one building or one place or one developer, but is much wider, is the problems clearly weren't just Grenfell. Some experts there believing there are developers who didn't follow just standard guidance at the time of building. Does that worry you?
Of course it worries me, Emily. Sadly, I can't say I'm surprised. My review, which I completed 3 years ago, that was exactly what I discovered when I talked to people, that we had a system that really was not working. where the level of oversight was insufficient and the behaviour of some people in the system. And I think we have to be careful here to remember that there are good people out there who are building good buildings, but there are some who are taking advantage of that lack of enforcement to cut corners, cut cost, and as I described it, that race to the bottom. So I'm not surprised by this story I've heard, but it does sadden me to hear that yet more people are caught with this problem.
But if you're one of those developers, should you be liable, no matter how long ago it was? I mean, there is a lack of enforcement, but should that responsibility still lie with the developers?
Of course it should. Of course it should. And one of the proposals in the new regulation, which will follow on from my recommendations when it's introduced into Parliament, will be a big shift in the way the system works. As you said in your report, at the moment, it relies upon spot checks by under-resourced regulatory resources. We haven't got enough to do the job to the level that needs to be done if people don't feel that responsibility for delivering safe buildings. The new regime will require the developers, the builders, to demonstrate to the regulator and to prove to the regulator that they have built what they said they were going to build, and that there is good reason to believe that that is a safe and effective building that's fit for people to live in.
That's not going to be retroactive,
so the onus
is it?
will change.
I mean, that's not going to be retrospective or retroactive. I guess one of the questions we're asking is, when the government says, as it has done plenty of times, it's the responsibility of developers to do the right thing, what do they mean by that? I mean, should they be making developers financially liable? Because at the moment it's falling on leaseholders. You know, Boris Johnson stood up, 17 times in Parliament and said, this is wrong, we must do the right thing. But developers don't feel the compunction to do that unless the law is actually changed, right?
Not entirely true. I think we are seeing some developers who are making provision, who are standing up and who are taking that responsibility, even when the legal time limits that are currently in place have gone past. But there's not enough of them. That's for sure. So what we have to do is to ensure to get the regulation right going forward. I acknowledge absolutely what you're saying, that still leaves us with this incredibly difficult problem of what's happened in the past. That's the problem that we have to wrestle with. And I would absolutely support the view that says leaseholders are the ones who are blameless. Leaseholders are the ones who have done all of the right things. And it is really, really sad and distressing for them that they find themselves in that position.
What would you say to leaseholders? I mean, what should they be doing if they get a bill for £100,000? What would you do?
Well, I think the first thing I would want to do is to understand why the work is necessary. Because one of the things that concerns me is the extent to which people are now overreacting to this need to look at buildings. My review, let's remember, was very much focused on high-rise buildings. My focus initially was on buildings of 10 stories or more. We subsequently lowered that threshold to 6 stories or more, or 18 metres. But we are now getting very focused on buildings that are lower than that. The facts are that the risks of fire in those buildings are rare. We know from the data that fires do not happen frequently. They are infrequent events. I know that people are still very scared about that, and I understand entirely why.
Okay.
But the reality is that if you're not in a real high-rise building, life safety, the ability is not at such great risk.
I guess it does, yeah, but it still doesn't.
Building
I mean,
safely,
fundamentally, it still doesn't help with the bill. You know, wherever you are in the building, if you have to pay that bill, or you can't sell your flat until
No.
Yeah.
But what I am suggesting is that in buildings of lower risk, it isn't clear to me why we are landing leaseholders with bills
With
of the
such big
size that we
okay,
are.
understood.
Residents
Okay.
should be involved in discussions about what are the cost-effective measures that can be taken to make that building safer.
Dame Judith, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.